A lot of our young people claim that there's an intellectual divide. They have to develop a certain intellectual schizophrenia to negotiate the mass culture and then the larger culture. They say that they have to think one way in the Muslim community, and then they have to shift and think another way in their schooling and in their education and their jobs. They have to adopt kind of like a double think. And sometimes it drives them nuts because sometimes it's not always easy to shift from one to the other. They say in the American community, these are some of the things that were said. In the American community, great emphasis is put on rationalism. And they claim, well, in the Muslim community, great emphasis is put on traditionalism, following the tradition, not rocking the boat. Don't question, especially if the questions are difficult to answer. That question is haram. It's haram to ask that question. You can't ask that question. Then you're non-Muslim. But what if I really have that question? Well, then you better get rid of it. But I can't get rid of it because I can't answer it. Well, then you're non-Muslim. Just put it out of your mind. Some of them actually email me, describe these kind of dilemmas. I remember when I first became a Muslim, I thought I would share with my community my experience. Of course, my experience was I was an atheist with all these objections to the existence of the idea of God, all merciful, divine creator. And then I had all these objections, and I read the Quran, and it answered my questions for me. So I would stand in front of an audience like this one, in a masjid or somewhere, and start to explain it. And I would begin by presenting the questions I had that led me to disbelieve in God. And I tell you the truth, brothers and sisters, I'd get halfway through the questions, and brothers would start standing up and say, this is haram. It's haram to even consider these questions. I told them, I'm going to tell you what came next. No, it was that way. But of course that was back in 1982. Things have progressed a little bit since then. But for many of our children, it is still that way. They have a question, you're a kafir. Don't ask that question. Don't you dare go to the imam with that question. Everybody in the community will say my children are kafir. They say that the larger society promotes individualism, celebrates the maverick who goes out there and blazes a trail, challenges tradition, thinks outside the box. They say the Muslim community puts great emphasis on strict conformance to community norms and standards. Don't rock the boat. Don't stand out. Just keep a low profile, unless you're going to represent an overall point of view. I could go on with this. Critical objective research is emphasized in one community, promoted in one community, adherence to the ancient authorities. I'm not saying these things are, one is bad and one is not. Just saying that for a lot of our kids, they feel that they're caught in an intellectual dilemma. Free speech and freedom of thought is celebrated in the United States of America and Canada. Of course, in the United States of America, under George Bush, it's almost meaningless now. But free speech and freedom of thought is still much celebrated in the United States of America. In the masjid, our young people complain that there are some very severe limitations on speech and thought. A lot of communities, you got to get before you can even say something in the masjid, you got to get permission from the leadership, and they have to know what you're going to say, and so forth and so on. All speech and thought is very strictly controlled, as it is in many third world oligarchies, for example. In any case, many of our kids for these are problems. Let me just summarize it rather than go down the intellectual doublethink that many of our young people complain of, and our converts. Basically, the idea is this. Many of our young people, they're not scholars of Islam. They're not university professors that are going to go out and start exploring and reading, going through ancient texts and things like that. most of them are just kids, and they are basing, and as they're growing up in America, they are weighing these two communities side by side. And they are intuitively trying to figure out which one makes more sense. And by and large, they are seeing the mainstream culture with all its faults and flaws. They're still seeing the mainstream culture as democratic, inclusive, tolerant, encourages mutual respect and objectivity, where arguments are won by rational thought. In contrast, many of them see their mosques as totalitarian, exclusivist, shutting out points of view that don't agree with the leadership, intolerant, patronizing, oppressive, and where proof and arguments are won by intimidation and threat. That's what the way they're seeing it. And many of them think that this religion just doesn't make sense. And like I said, they associate it with Islam. And they email me, well, Islam requires this. And I have to email them back and say, are you sure that Islam requires that? That's how deeply confused they are. Because ever since they were kids, they were told Islam requires this, Islam requires that. Let me give you an example of the type of concrete examples they give me. One young lady said, my dad doesn't have a clue how I'm going to get married someday. She said, my dad tells me that if I see one of my classmates in a mall or something like that, or out on the street when I'm with my family, and he's a non-Muslim, it's okay if I go up and talk to him. Say hello and things like that. If he's a Muslim, I can't talk to him. On the other hand, he tells me at the same time that if he's a non-Muslim, I can't marry him, but if he's a Muslim, I have to marry him. So she said, here it is, the boys that I have no chance of marrying, I can talk to them, but the boys that I'm supposed to marry, I could never talk to them. Another young lady wrote me and she said, it's really strange. They keep us so separated from each other in the chaperoned environment of the community. They keep us so segregated from one another and secluded from one another that we virtually have no contact with Muslims of the opposite gender. She said, so what happens is, in reality, for every 1 minute of contact I have with a Muslim male who someday I'm supposed to marry from among them, I have 1,000 minutes of inadvertent contact with non-Muslim males who I'm not supposed to marry someday. She said, is it any wonder that Muslim girl after Muslim girl is falling in love with non-Muslim boys? 1,000 to 1. And it says in the Quran that God has put, a mutual attraction between the sexes, in human nature, etc. This magnetism and drawing them together. She said, what do they expect? A young boy wrote me. He said to me, my dad is a social schizophrenic. When he's at the masjid and he sees a female fully covered, dressed modest as can be, he sees them, he's shocked, and immediately turns around and faces the opposite direction. And then at work, on the Thanksgiving holiday, he always has a special day where they celebrate, Thanksgiving at work. And he's invited us, of course, his family to go to that. And he's putting his arm around ladies, talking to them, chatting, etc., the non-Muslim lady. Why does my dad find a Muslim lady fully dressed more threatening to morality than a non-Muslim lady in a short skirt at a Thanksgiving party? In an open environment. And they're starting to say, this just doesn't make sense. And I can give you an example after example after example.